Narrator, calm, reflective. Empires rarely fall with a scream. More often, they crack slowly under the weight of their own illusions. But once the break begins, it cannot be stopped. In 1911, when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was gunned down in Sarajevo, few imagined that Russia, vast, ancient, and mysterious, would emerge not victorious, but shattered. Why did an empire with the largest army in Europe collapse so quickly? What inner fault lines were exposed by the fires of the First World War? And why did millions of Russians march off to a war that would end their monarchy, their peace, and their world? This is not just a story of soldiers and battles. It is the story of a civilization unraveling from within. This is the fall of Imperial Russia, as seen from the inside. To understand the First World War through Russia's eyes, we must go back, not to the trenches of the Western Front, but to the humiliation of a war in the Far East. In 1911, Russia was defeated by Japan, a shock to the world and a wound to Russian pride. This wasn't just a military loss. It was the first time in modern history that a European power had been defeated by an Asian nation in a major war. The loss exposed the limits of Russian industry, the incompetence of its officer corps, and the rot inside the Romanov regime. Waves of anger swept through cities. Strikes turned to street violence. By the end of that year, Russia had experienced its first revolution, the Revolution of 1911. It failed to overthrow the Tsar, but it left scars, and a monarchy weakened, now ruling more by inertia than divine right. Empires that appear powerful from the outside often rot in silence on the inside. Russia, on the eve of the Great War, was such a place. On paper, the Russian Empire was a titan. More than 1 trillion subjects, the largest land army in Europe, a vast reserve of natural resources, and an ancient monarchy ruling by divine right. But beneath that surface, the railways were primitive, the officer class aristocratic and outdated. Peasants made up the bulk of the army, illiterate, poorly trained, and often barefoot. And industry lagged far behind that of Britain, France, or Germany. When war came in, Muahe Nam 19, Muay Bon, Russia was not ready. Not spiritually, not militarily, and certainly not politically. But war came all the same. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand, a minor royal in a far-off Balkan city, quickly ignited the powder keg of alliances and rivalries. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, and Russia, eager to assert its role as protector of the Slavs, mobilized. France backed Russia. Germany backed Austria-Hungary. Britain, reluctantly, followed. And, within days, the world was at war. For Russia, this was not just about diplomacy. It was about identity. The Russian state had long imagined itself as the shield of Slavic peoples, a sacred guardian of Orthodox Christianity in the Balkans, a moral bulwark against the decadent West and the Islamic Ottomans. Supporting Serbia wasn't just a matter of honor. It was a matter of destiny. Or so the Tsar believed. And so the armies marched. In Thangtam-Num 19 Muy Bon, 2 massive Russian armies pushed into East Prussia, hoping to strike quickly at the heart of the German Empire. At first, it worked. Russian troops won at Gumbinnen, causing real panic among German generals. But then, the trap was sprung. At Tannenberg, the Russian Second Army was annihilated. More than Mort-Trum-Gan men were captured. Entire divisions were wiped out. Their commanding general Samsonov took his own life in shame. It was one of the most catastrophic defeats in Russian military history. From that moment on, the Russian war effort would be defined by a pattern of initial bravery followed by brutal collapse. The Germans pushed them out of East Prussia for good. And though the Russians had some success against Austria-Hungary and Galicia, their lines were stretched, their supplies low, and their soldiers weary. Narrator, grim, visceral. The Russian army wasn't just losing ground. It was bleeding. Endlessly. By the end of 19 the Tsar's armies were already running out of rifles. One Russian general wrote, "In some regiments, 1 man in 3 has no weapon. They wait under fire for their comrades to fall, so they can pick up their rifles." This was not a modern army. It was a human meat grinder. Narrator, reflective, somber. Yet even as the bodies piled up, the war expanded. In Thang Muye Num 19 Muye Bon, the Ottoman Empire joined the war, bombarding Russian ports on the Black Sea. For the Russian people, this made the war feel more justifiable. The Ottomans were ancient enemies. The prize Constantinople still glittered in the Russian imagination. Once the capital of Orthodox Byzantium, now in Muslim hands, it was the city the Tsars had long dreamed of reclaiming. Britain and France even promised the Russians they could have it after the war. It was a dangerous promise, and one that would never be fulfilled. Narrator, with gravity. But the war in the Caucasus was brutal. The Ottomans and Russians clashed in a land of mountains, snow, and ethnic tension. The Russians, with Armenian support, crushed the Ottoman army at Sarikamish in Thong Mort Num 19 Moylum. The cost to the Ottoman Empire was immense, and their response was genocide. In Thong Tu Num 19 Moylum, Ottoman authorities began the systematic extermination of Armenians, one of the darkest chapters in 20th century history. It would stain the war and the region forever. Narrator, quiet, observant. Meanwhile, the Germans were sharpening their blades. In the summer of 19 Muilum, they unleashed the Gorlice-Tarnow Offensive, a massive joint campaign with Austria-Hungary that broke the Russian lines. More than Mortrum, Bon Muingan Russian soldiers were captured. Warsaw fell. Then Brest. Then Vilnius. Entire provinces were lost. By Thang Bay, Russian generals were begging the French for help. But help was not coming. Instead, Russian soldiers waited unarmed, exposed, desperate. And when the order came, they retreated. 1 Trumgan square kilometers were abandoned in the Great Retreat. The Tsar, desperate to turn the tide, made a fateful decision. He took personal command of the army. In the annals of monarchy, few acts are more reckless than what Tsar Nicholas II did in 19 Muelam. By taking personal command of the army, he chained the fate of his dynasty to the performance of a broken war machine. The Russian army, still noble in spirit, but ill-equipped, poorly led, and bleeding men by the tens of thousands, now bore not just the burden of war, but of the monarchy's survival. Every failure at the front would now be seen as the Tsar's own, and the front would continue to fail. Narrator, philosophical. The empire that Nicholas ruled was not merely Russia. It was a multi-ethnic sprawl. Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Finns, Tatars, Armenians, Kazakhs, Chechens, all forced under the double-headed eagle of Romanov rule. The war inflamed every crack. While Russian soldiers died on the front, German troops advanced into Baltic provinces, Austro-Hungarians flooded into Galicia, and supply trains broke down under snow and incompetence. Inflation soared. Bread grew scarce. And in the cities, whispers became curses. Then chants. Narrator, vivid, intense. In Osowiec Fortress, the German army, frustrated by Russian resistance, decided to unleash poison gas. The Russians had no masks. Chlorine burned their lungs, melted their eyes, peeled flesh from bone. The Germans advanced confidently, expecting only corpses. But from the fog, they saw them rise. Russian soldiers, their faces shredded, coughing blood, staggering, charged with bayonets. The Germans panicked. They fled. This moment, surreal and ghastly, would be remembered as the attack of the dead men. It was heroic, but it was also a death rattle, because the fortress, like the empire it belonged to, could not hold forever. Narrator, slow, solemn. As the war dragged into its second year, the Russian economy began to collapse under its own weight. Industrial output declined. Food distribution failed. Millions of peasants were conscripted, leaving no one to till the fields. The cities starved. By 19 Muisao, bread riots, strikes, and whispers of revolution were rising across the empire. And at the heart of it all was a man many blamed, but few understood. Grigory Rasputin. Narrator, haunting. Rasputin, the mystic monk, was a peasant who had somehow wormed his way into the palace. To some, he was a prophet. To others, a fraud. But to the Tsarina, he was a savior, the only one who could ease the bleeding of her hemophiliac son, Alexei. While Nicholas commanded armies, Rasputin whispered in Alexandra's ear. He appointed ministers, fired generals, and spread an air of rot through the court. One newspaper called him the Mad Monk. Nobles plotted his death. And in Thang Muyenam 19 Muisao, they finally acted. They poisoned him, shot him, beat him, and still, he tried to rise. They dumped his body in the frozen river, and when they found it, his lungs were filled with water. He had drowned, still breathing after all else failed. Narrator with gravitas. But even Rasputin's death could not save the monarchy. The army was exhausted. Discipline collapsed. Desertion became rampant. In Thang Mortnam 19 Moibai, another offensive Lake Narok ended in catastrophe. Thousands froze to death. Tens of thousands died for a few miles of mud. The French had begged for a distraction to ease pressure at Verdun. Russia gave it to them at the cost of its own lifeblood. The war had become an act of national suicide. Narrator with building intensity. Then came Brusilov. General Alexei Brusilov, a man of reform and bold ideas, proposed an offensive in Galicia to strike at the heart of the Austro-Hungarian lines. He trained his men carefully, abandoned mass assaults, focused artillery on weak points, and launched a surprise that shocked the world. In just 4 days, the Austro-Hungarian Fourth Army lost nearly Bay Mui Fun Trum of its men. Russian soldiers surged forward. By the summer of 19, Muisao, Austria, was on the verge of collapse. Romania, seeing Russian success, joined the war on the side of the Allies. But victory would again turn to ash. Germany rushed reinforcements. The offensive ground to a halt, and Romania was swiftly crushed, its capital occupied, its army shattered. Narrator with a slow burn. Back home, discontent became rage. The draft was expanded to include Central Asian Muslims, a group that had not responded to the Ottoman call for jihad, but also never fought for the Tsar. They rebelled. In the Kivan uprising, the steppes of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan erupted in chaos. Tens of thousands were killed in the brutal suppression. Hundreds of thousands fled to China. The empire was bleeding internally. Narrator transitioning. By Thong Hai Num 19 Moibai, it was over, though few knew it yet. In Petrograd, the capital, women marched for bread. Workers struck. Soldiers mutinied. The Tsar, isolated in his train, abdicated. 300 years of Romanov rule ended with a signature on a dirty scrap of paper. The abdication of Tsar Nicholas II marked the formal end of imperial autocracy in Russia. But the empire's agony was far from over. As the Tsar boarded his train into exile, the question of power became immediate and dangerously unclear. A provisional government was formed, composed mostly of liberal politicians and moderates. They promised reform. They promised democracy. They promised to continue the war. And that last promise would prove fatal. At the same time, a second power was rising. The Petrograd Soviet, made up of workers and soldiers. It claimed to speak for the streets, it controlled the garrisons, and in truth, it held the city. This arrangement, known as dual power, was unstable from the beginning. One government spoke for legality, the other spoke for reality. And over it all loomed a deeper question. Would Russia stay in the war? The provisional government said yes. It hoped that victory alongside the Allies would give it legitimacy, international recognition, and maybe even territorial gains. But the Russian people, tired, hungry, broken, wanted something else entirely. They wanted bread. They wanted peace. They wanted land. Into this fracture stepped a man who had once been exiled, once dismissed, once unknown to most Russians. His name was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Smuggled into Russia by the Germans in a sealed train, Lenin returned to Petrograd in April 1917 with a single obsession: to turn the imperial war into a social revolution. His slogans were simple and deadly: peace, land, and bread. All power to the Soviets. And most importantly, an immediate end to the war, no matter the cost. The provisional government, meanwhile, launched one last grand offensive, the Kerensky Offensive, named after its charismatic leader, Alexander Kerensky. It collapsed almost immediately. The Russian army, starved and shattered, refused to fight. Soldiers deserted by the thousands. Some killed their officers. Others simply walked home. Morale was not low. It was dead. By the autumn of 1917, the provisional government had no legitimacy, no control over the army, and no authority in the countryside. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, sensing their moment, acted. On the night of October 25, 1917, Red Guards stormed the Winter Palace. It was less a battle than a seizure. The revolution came quietly, efficiently. And when it was done, the Bolsheviks were in power. No more Tsar. No more provisional government. No more war, at least. Not yet. The Bolsheviks moved quickly. They nationalized land. They called for worker control of factories. And they opened negotiations with Germany to end Russia's participation in the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, was brutal. Russia lost vast territories: Ukraine, the Baltics, Belarus, and more. The country was carved up to secure peace. Millions of Russians found themselves overnight subjects of foreign powers. It was a national humiliation, but to Lenin, it was a necessary sacrifice. The revolution, he believed, could not survive another month of war. But peace with Germany did not bring peace to Russia. Instead, it triggered a new and more savage war, a civil war, fought between Reds and Whites, revolutionaries and monarchists, communists and conservatives. Foreign armies invaded, cities burned, famine stalked the countryside. The Great War had unmade an empire, but the Civil War would remake the very identity of the nation itself. By the end of it, there would be no Tsar, no nobles, no church hierarchy, only a new kind of power-cold, ideological, total. The story of Russia in the First World War is not one of glory. It is one of disillusionment, decay, and transformation. An empire that entered the war hoping to assert its greatness, exited it broken, its people betrayed, its monarch dead, and its society reborn through fire. The revolution had promised peace, land, and bread. But the Russia that emerged from the First World War was a wasteland of betrayal, suspicion, and ruin. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had torn the country's western frontier away, handing over entire provinces to the Central Powers. Yet this sacrifice didn't bring stability. Instead, it invited chaos. The civil war that followed was not a neat struggle between two clear sides. It was a labyrinth of conflict: Reds against Whites, peasants against landlords, anarchists against Bolsheviks, nationalist movements fighting both foreign and domestic enemies. And hovering at the edges, foreign powers, Britain, France, Japan, and the United States, intervened, fearing that Lenin's revolution might spread. The Russian countryside became a battlefield of shifting lines and shifting loyalties. In Siberia, the Czech Legion former prisoners of war took control of the Trans-Siberian Railway. In the south, General Denikin's White armies advanced on Moscow. In the Far East, Japanese troops occupied Vladivostok. And across the vast steppes, famine, typhus, and execution squads reaped the harvest the war had sown. What had begun as a European conflict now completed its mutation into something far more destructive: the birth of a new ideological world. A communist Russia, led by Lenin and his inner circle, began to shape a system unlike anything Europe had seen before. The aristocracy was gonets, estates burned, its titles worthless. The Orthodox Church, once a pillar of Tsarist authority, was stripped of power, its priests imprisoned or shot. Even the calendar changed. The old Julian calendar with its saints and seasons was replaced with the Gregorian standard. Time itself had been rewritten. But the legacy of the First World War endured, even amid these revolutionary flames. For while Lenin and the Bolsheviks had pulled Russia out of the war early, the social, economic, and psychological costs had already been paid. Over 2 million Russian soldiers had died. Another 5 million were wounded. Entire generations of peasant conscripts had disappeared into the mud of Galicia, the snows of East Prussia, and the passes of the Caucasus. Cities like Warsaw, Riga, and Vilnius, part of the Tsar's dominion, were now lost to history, folded into new states or new empires. And in their place, on the map and in the Russian mind, was a void, the aching emptiness left by an imperial collapse. The imperial dream had died, but the imperial trauma remained. It would shape how the new Soviet state viewed the world, surrounded by enemies, suspicious of allies, scarred by betrayal, yet determined to endure. Even after the Civil War ended, even after the Red Army had claimed victory and the Bolsheviks had silenced their rivals, the wounds of the First World War would remain unhealed. In the 1920s, Soviet leaders would look at the shattered borders and lost territories and begin to dream again not of a Tsarist empire, but of a different kind of domination. Ideological, economic, strategic. The lesson was cruel and clear. Weakness invites invasion. Division invites collapse. And war, once begun, can outlive every peace treaty. The Russian experience in the First World War stands apart from that of Britain, France, or even Germany. Those nations suffered, but they emerged with their states intact. Russia did not. It entered the war an empire. It exited it a revolution. And the cost of that transition, measured not just in lives, but in identities, in memories, in lost cities and broken loyalties, would shape the entire course of the 20th century. In the decades to come, Soviet leaders would invoke the memory of the First World War not as a triumph, but as a caution. Never again would Russia be caught unprepared. Never again would the people suffer while the elites danced. And never again would foreign powers dictate the fate of the Russian heartland. Yet that promise too would unravel in time. Because the empire that fell in 1917 had not been destroyed only by enemies. It had been destroyed by fear, delusion, and the weight of its own lies. And those, too, are things that no revolution can fully erase. But history is never truly finished. The fall of Imperial Russia and its chaotic exit from the First World War did not only reshape the Russian state, it created deep fissures in the world's political order that would echo across the 20th century. For what the West saw as the collapse of a backward monarchy, the Bolsheviks framed as a global awakening. Lenin believed Russia was only the beginning. Berlin, Vienna, even Paris, all would fall in time to the working class. The trauma of the Great War, he believed, had primed Europe for revolution. Class struggle would ignite where nationalism had failed. The proletariat would inherit the battlefield. But the revolutions in Germany and Hungary fizzled, or were crushed. The Red Advance would not cross the Elbe. The war had broken Europe's monarchies, but not yet its capitalist order. And so, the Soviet regime, born in revolution and baptized in civil war, turned inward. It faced a devastated country. Famine raged. Railroads lay in ruin. The countryside smoldered with the memory of peasant revolts. Entire regions were depopulated. And the wounds left by the Great War, the refugee crises, the economic collapse, the psychic shock, were still wide open. Yet, even in ruin, the state persisted. A new army was built, one no longer loyal to a crown but to a creed. A new bureaucracy rose, staffed not by nobles but by commissars. A new intelligence apparatus, the Cheka, hunted counter-revolutionaries with relentless zeal. The new state would not tolerate dissent. It would not allow another fall. And in a bitter irony, many of the same problems that doomed the Romanovs were now absorbed into the DNA of the Soviet regime: paranoia, centralization, a disregard for human cost in the name of a greater vision. The First World War had not just toppled one system, it had written the blueprint for another. What had once been Tsarist, slogans of orthodoxy and autocracy, were replaced with Marxist terms: class struggle, dialectical materialism, historical inevitability. But the machinery of control remained. Uniforms changed, flags changed, the face above the palace gate changed. But the state endured. And it remembered. It remembered the humiliation of Tannenberg, the failure of supply lines in the snow, the betrayal of allies who promised help and gave none, the price of going to war unprepared. These memories would shape how the Soviet Union would prepare for the next global conflict with fanatic vigilance, with mass industrialization, and with a paranoia so deep it would consume its own people. For when Germany rose again under Hitler, and when tanks once more crossed the plains of Poland, it was these scars, these lessons that steeled Soviet resolve. The Soviet Union would go on to triumph in the Second World War. But it would do so not because it forgot the first, but because it never did. In classrooms and commissariats, in military academies and party congresses, the story of Russia's fall in the First World War was retold as a warning. Weakness invites disaster. Disunity invites conquest. Peace is never guaranteed, and loyalty to the revolution must be absolute. These were not just the lessons of war. They were the founding myths of a new order. Even today, more than a century later, the Russian memory of the Great War is uniquely haunted. Unlike in France or Britain, there are few monuments to the soldiers of 1914, no triumphant arches, no ceremonies, no parades, because for Russia, the war was not a victory, it was a wound. A war that did not end in peace, but in civil war. A war that did not return soldiers home, but scattered them across exile, prison, or graves. A war that did not preserve the nation, but broke it into pieces and reassembled it under a new name. The Russian Empire, once so proud, once so vast, died not with a bang, but with the grinding silence of retreating armies, the closing of factory gates, the final whispers of a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries. And from its ashes, something colder, harder, and more enduring would rise. The revolution, the Civil War, the Soviet century, all of it, in some way, was born in the trenches of Galicia and the snows of East Prussia. And that is why, to understand Russia today, one must begin with the war that unmade it.